I am Ned Stanley. I am the Director of National Voices and Communications here at 50CAN. And I'm joined today by three incredible local leaders from across our network. We have Stephen Quinn, who is our Director of Outreach at GeorgiaCAN. Victor Evans, who is our Executive Director at TennesseeCAN. And Ariel Smith, who's Co-Executive Director of Transform Education Now in Colorado. And if everyone could just mute, Maddie, if you could mute, getting a little background noise, that would be great. All right, so I want to just talk a little bit about how today is going to work. I want to start by just grounding you all in the Fund Everything policy brief, which is a policy brief 50CAN released this summer in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and what we think needs to happen both immediately and over the long term to really reimagine our school system to better meet the needs of kids and families who are just really struggling right now. Then I'm going to give our local leaders an opportunity to discuss what's happening in this state, in their states, the wins that they've gotten, and some of the tactics that they've employed. And then at the end of this conversation, we'll open it up to questions from you all. So if you do have questions, you'll see the question and answer box on the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Go ahead and type in questions as they come to you, and then we'll pick and choose at the end and try to get to as many of them as we can. All right, so Fund Everything. It's clear, and you all know that we are currently going through a crisis, and what children are experiencing right now is completely unacceptable. We are extremely concerned across this network about the learning loss that's going on. And we recognize that in order to address the sheer amount of needs that have developed as a result of this pandemic, we have to be incredibly bold in the policies that we're pursuing and in how we're investing in our schools. And so the goal that we have with Fund Everything is to both address the immediate needs of kids and families, but then also pave the way for the future. Because if you look at polling that's been out in the field, parents just are not satisfied with the education system in general. And even after the virus has passed, even once we're in a recovery mode, they don't want things to go back to the way that the school system has always been. So in some ways, there's an opportunity here as well. Fund Everything is based on three principles of support, which are also guiding lights for us at 50CAN. The first is we have to listen to students and their families. They know their needs and their desires better than any bureaucrat, and they can absolutely, if we're really working to meet their needs, we're going to create a system which is better for them. We also need to make sure that we're reaching students where they are. Our friends at Bellwether produced a report that I'm sure you all have seen showing that 3 million kids or more are potentially missing from distance learning across the country. So we need to figure out how we can reach students no matter the environments that they're finding themselves in a way that works for them. And then finally, we think, this is going to be a time of innovation. This is going to be a time where we need to try different things and see what works, pedagogically speaking, logistically speaking. And so we need to be funding and supporting the types of experimentation and research that will lead us to best practices and bright spots that can be replicated over time. And we'll speak more about all of these today. So when we say Fund Everything, essentially what we're saying is we need to fund existing schools such that they can open safely if they so choose, or if they're providing distance learning, that distance learning can be provided in a much better way. It also means funding alternative options like education pods and micro schools, and getting money directly to parents and families so that they're able to take advantage of the same options that more privileged parents are able to. And it also means for parents who are choosing to homeschool their children that we are funding their needs as well. And that is the policy brief in a nutshell. If you're interested in learning more, you can find the 50CAN Fund Everything brief on the 50CAN website, as well as a companion report called Measure Everything. And we think the two are very interconnected. But with that said, I want to turn to the real stars of the show here, who's the panel of local leaders that we have for you here today. And I'm going to go ahead and start with Ariel Smith in Denver, Colorado. Ariel, Colorado has piloted a bunch of new and really interesting efforts. I know in the Adams 12 district, they have created some education pods for families so that families have that as a choice if they want. And then also the broader county has been providing micro grants to some students for educational needs. I know you've been a key player here in speaking and elevating the voices of families. And what is it that you have been hearing from these families? And how are these innovations that are currently going on in Adams County, in what ways will they serve as a proof point for you moving forward?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And thank you for having me today. A little bit about TEN and what we do in Colorado. We work directly with families since March when the COVID crisis started and students went remote. We have been checking in with families every day about how they're experiencing learning and what they need. We make around 700 to 1,000 phone calls a week to families with the support of our parent fellows. And on those calls, we ask 3 questions. The first question is really about food security, making sure that families have what they need in order to survive and have the dignity that they deserve. The second thing is we make sure that they have access to technology. We handed out a ton of laptops and computers and hotspots this spring. And then the third thing is we really assess how remote learning is going and start to move families into our digital organizing community, which is actually more robust than it's ever been before, which I wish I had known that Zoom meetings were easier for families a long time ago because I would have used them. But in those conversations, there have been a couple of things that have really boiled to the top in terms of common trends. The first is that a lot of families really are in need of a safe in-person learning environment for their students because they don't have the luxury of being home right now. They're essential workers. They're people who have to work outside the home in order to continue to provide for their families. And so having schools closed has been really hard for them because there's a lack of options in terms of childcare or a high quality education outside the home. And so pods have been one of the things that have been able to solve for that for a lot of families. And so we have families across the state who are building pods, but they're not always supported by their district. And we're seeing very clearly in Adams 12 that when districts support small group learning environments or pods directly, they are able to bring back more students. Adams 12, their attendance rates are really a huge proof point for how well these are working. There's about 36,000 kids in Adams 12, and we are currently, we have about 718 kids who are not attending school regularly. So it's about 1% of the population. To give you a contrast, Denver Public Schools, that's not really offering a ton of options for students and families right now, is missing about 12% of their 93,000 students. So about 11,000 students are missing from the district every day. Across the state, it's around 86,000 students who we are not engaging in school regularly right now, which will be a huge problem long term, which leads us to the other thing that we're hearing from families, which is families are really in need of additional interventions and supports and resources. There's not a phone call that I'm on every day where a family member is not like, if only I could afford a tutor right now, if only I could afford additional supplies to help my student, support my student at home. I think what we're finding is that even though I know that there are a lot of educators who are trying really hard through this, there are a lot of families who are just not finding that the supports that the schools are offering are enough for their kids. And they're learning that their kids are behind, and they're worried that their kids are falling farther behind as a result of COVID-related learning loss. And so we are really in the process of trying to figure out a method in which we can provide families with some kind of education stimulus so that they could support their students as they see fit, which is the other advocacy campaign we're working on right now.
Thank you, Ariel. I know I, for one, am going to be really interested to see how these early proof points are going to translate into later victories across the state that you all are working on. I'm going to pivot now to Victor Evans in Tennessee. I know TennesseeCAN had a major win, and I know details are still forthcoming from the governor's office, but a major win in ensuring federal coronavirus aid would go directly to families to fund their educational needs. I'd love to hear, Victor, what you were seeing and hearing on the ground that led you to prioritize this and really work with policymakers to drive them to action.
Thank you, Ned, and thank you to Governor Bush and Patricia for this putting this event together. And I know it's a little different this year, but I'm really excited to be here with all of you. So yes, Ned, we Tennessee received a good deal of federal aid to support education, learning for our kids during COVID, and the grant you're referring to is the Rethink K-12 Models Grant, where Tennessee, fortunately, was actually the only state to receive the full $20 million. Before I dive too much into that, I want to just give everyone a little bit of background about TennesseeCAN. So we're a statewide organization. We focus on advocacy, policy, and then a lot of our work lies around these elite negotiations with key stakeholders. And so going back to March, April, when all this commenced, we wanted to say, how can we ensure that we're still serving the needs of kids, that we're still helping parents advocate for their kids? And so we identified what the problems were, and the problems lay in the types of learning that were available or lack thereof. So some schools were going in person, some schools were going virtual, and then some schools were doing a hybrid. And in talking to parents, putting out surveys, talking directly to parents, talking directly to teachers, parents were concerned about three things: the quality of online learning, school safety, and then their children falling behind. And then, of course, some were concerned about broadband access, depending on what area of the state you're in. So it was incumbent upon us to come up with some of those solutions. And again, going back to those elite negotiations, it was important for us to ensure that we were advocating on behalf of families through stakeholders that make these decisions. So those are people in the legislative branch, people in the executive branch, ensuring that we are relaying the messages from families to those stakeholders. So that direct legislative advocacy, and this is where the power of relationships lie. Now, ensuring you have strong relationships with legislators, committee chairs, education committee chairs, and then people in the governor's office. And then, again, speaking directly to parents, because you cannot adequately advocate for parents if you're not sure what those stories are. And then the third piece to make it all come together is connecting parents with legislators to ensuring that there is a direct contact there. And so as a result of doing those three things, we provided several recommendations to the governor's office and our Department of Education about how we can solve some of these problems, mainly being mitigating learning loss and ensuring that education could continue. So going back to Ned's point about dollars directly into the hands of families, it was important that we got money to families right away. And so you had the wave of the CARES Act. You had the wave of the GEAR dollars, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund dollars. And then there was a third round where you had, like I said, the Rethink K-12 Models Grant. And what was probably most exciting about the third round was the fact that this is, one of the rare times that the federal government sends money to a state, but doesn't really tell you how to use it, right? So, our state is trying to be super creative to ensure that we're meeting the needs of families. One thing that TennesseeCAN we've been advocating for is getting those dollars directly into the hands of families so that families can decide exactly how they want to use those dollars. Because we believe that families and parents know what's best for their kids. Every child is different. Every family is different. As we say in Tennessee, every grand division is different. So we need to ensure that we're getting those dollars directly into the hands of those families so they can do what is best for their children. Some of the recommendations that we made include investing in digital infrastructure, funding all schools equitably, right? Public charter and private, and then funding tutoring. So, a family in Memphis, where a lot of our work happens, and then a family in Upper East Tennessee in the more rural parts who are both, disappointed and, underwhelmed with the quality of online learning, have dollars that they can use to fund a tutor for as an option for their kids. And then something else, before I close out here, something else that as part of a solution that we should really consider is, COVID has made us really want to rethink how you fund education. So we've got to take a hard look at how exactly we're funding education. Are we funding education in a way that adequately meets the needs of all students, the specific needs of all students? And that's something that we should continue to explore.
Thanks, Victor. I mean, congratulations on the early victory, and also eager to see how TennesseeCAN continues to push forward. You spoke about the importance of parents and elevating parent voice, and I think that's the perfect transition to Mr. Stephen Quinn in Georgia, who I know fairly single-handedly this year has trained thousands of parents as advocates, and is really just a superstar organizer. Stephen, I know GeorgiaCAN was recently thanked by the superintendent of Atlanta for connecting parents to resources, and there have been others that have noticed that as a result of your work in parent organizing, that the conversation and narrative around direct funding of families has really begun to change in the state. I'd love to hear more about this grassroots movement that you're building and what they're fired up about, and then also tactically what you've done to mobilize these folks.
Thanks, Ned. Yeah, I think this year has been interesting. Like similar to what TennesseeCAN and TEN has done, we've engaged parents across the state, and that is the core values of our work here at GeorgiaCAN. We really want to empower parents to fight for high quality education in the Peach State. And I think, we launched an effort right as the pandemic started to engage parents with a parent support call. Those calls were weekly calls where we got to know what families were facing at the moment in the time, and really understood where we could actually have those conversations about what does this look like. And so each week we'd have over 100 to 200 parents on these calls connecting and talking about the things that they need and then providing resources directly to them. Once the school year ended, we started to really engage parents one-on-one. We really had those opportunities to sit down to talk about the specific needs and then look at the solutions that are out there. I think about this in one of our stories of one of our parents, Zan, who literally uprooted her life from literally Northwest Atlanta to back home in Warner Robins, Georgia, just because she needed support to teaching her kid this year. I think I really identified the needs of families with students with special needs. One of the biggest things that we saw was there was a huge disconnect between virtual learning for them and the way that it was currently happening, as well as districts not providing the services that they needed. And when we found these stories, it just kind of launched us into more solutions. And the solutions that we found were important. I think families wanted direct payments to pay for either technology or maybe have access to learning pods or tutoring services, or even creating or access to a curriculum to maybe doing some homeschooling or supporting them in that next step. We also found that parents wanted access to knowing more about where are these learning pods? And so creating a tracker for the city of Atlanta was one of our priorities, and it was noted by the superintendent. But I think this kind of led us to creating what is called a focus group in our work. We brought together parents across the state to really talk about the solutions. And what we landed on was microgrants. So at the time, Oklahoma, Florida, and South Carolina had programs that existed already. And so we let parents take a look at those programs. We asked them questions like, what do they like about it? What they didn't like about it? Like, what is financially important to them, right? I think one of those things was this was a great opportunity to really get into the policy work with parents. And then we identified kind of a campaign to launch. And what we found was that parents were all on board once they kind of knew how these grants would work and potentially be impactful for them. So we launched a campaign to contact the governor's office. We had nearly almost 1,000 parents across the state of Georgia either call or email their governor on this issue. We worked in coalitions to bring on media hits on the issue. So we had parents tell their story personally about like, how is this impacting them through op-eds and through news articles. And then we expanded our coalition. I think this was something that we found with our parent base. They were able to find local groups that were on board with us to add our coalition of nearly 21 groups across the state that supported a microgrant program like this one. And I think that's the bigger thing that we found out of our work is that we're changing the narrative here in Georgia. Groups are more open to this discussion than they ever have been before because I think we're in this crisis. And I hope that leads us into the next year, which is a success, hopefully, for a broader coalition of support for potentially maybe an ESA or a private school choice in our work.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, there's really such a unique opportunity here, I think, to expand coalitions beyond their traditional boundaries. So really exciting that work is taking place in Georgia. Just a reminder to all attendees, if you have questions for our panelists, please go ahead and plug them into the questions and answers section. I've got a few more questions for the panelists myself, and then we'll turn to yours. You all, I would love to pivot to a conversation over tactics, over how this work gets done. And let me start with you, Victor and Stephen, because it seems to me that the two of you have taken decently different approaches to change making in your states. Victor, you spoke about the need for elite negotiations, meeting with the governor and legislators and trying to get elected officials to make change that way. Stephen, you spoke more about the need to build social movements and the importance of the grassroots and elevating parent voice from the ground up. I'm curious as to why you've prioritized the tactics that you have and any trade-offs that may be taking place as a result. Victor, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thank you, Ned. Absolutely. Going the route of engaging legislators and engaging, the governor's office and even our Department of Education, super important as they are the ones who create the laws, sign off on the laws, are the references for K-12 education. So it's important that we fully engage them on the front end. Fortunately, we live in a state where those three entities are very much aligned with a lot of our policies. So it's important that you engage those groups on the front end to be a resource. Like, hey, like these are some things that we're thinking about. These are some things. Here's some opportunities with all this money coming down from Washington. Like I said, there's great opportunities to be innovative in how we attack education while not letting things backslide due to the pandemic. And then, so that's what I call three phases of this. So the first phase is engaging those groups, as I mentioned, with our recommendations on the front end when COVID first started. The second piece is following up to make sure that those things occur. So, for example, we made recommendations in April, and then some were around funding things, some were around your more, measure everything, as we say at 50CAN and TennesseeCAN, around assessments. So a start of year checkpoint to assess learning loss that happened. We made sure that happened. And then the other piece is engaging during the legislative process. Our legislature was in legislative session 3 times this calendar year, and then an additional time for some House education hearings. So engaging during those times as well. And then there's a fourth bonus that, depending on your state and your state's politics, can help or hurt. Fortunately, it helped on our side. But the elections matter. People who are your friends getting reelected, people who maybe not are your friend, or maybe you're not your friends, maybe not running for office, and then filling those seats with people who are aligned with your policy. Super important, because that can impact policy down the road, that can impact the dynamics of a legislature or the Senate chamber or the House chamber. So it's important to ensure that you're engaging those entities throughout the year and on the front end and following up.
Thanks. That's really interesting, especially this piece around following up after initially pushing forward proposals. I like that. Stephen, tell me more about the grassroots side of things. Why take that approach specifically? What's been the value there?
Yeah, I think parent voice is like the key piece of this. At the end of the day, when you're really trying to connect policy and move policy through, you've got to have parent voice, or you've got to have a personal connection to it. And one of the things that we found with our work when we did the groundwork of this focus group, connecting parents back to this idea of this policy, we had a lot of buy-in, and they were willing to tell their stories about how and what was going on currently in their households. And I think when you start to put that out there into the world through media and through different avenues, like, it starts to become a more prominent conversation, and it builds momentum on it. I will say, we had parents literally be interviewed, and then the news organization would literally call the governor's office and say, hey, what is your stance on this? Where do you fall on this issue? And I think parent voice is so powerful in this space. If we don't and highlight it even more, it's going to be kind of a wash in the conversation. I think about this in a lot of the work that we do at our state, is that telling their story can go a long way, and it shares like the impact that we have. I go back to Todd Hartle's story. He's a parent in Decatur here in Georgia. And Todd has a kid with Down syndrome. And, one of the things that he told in his story was that, his kid's a learner through tactile ways, and virtual learning was just not working. He would spend 30 minutes and that was it for the day. And so being able to have an in-person option, or to have like a learning pod or something that could be beneficial, could be super powerful for his learning and not regressing in this space. And so when you hear that story, you see the personal connection back to the issue that we're working on, and that maybe makes lawmakers and elected officials move on that, as well as give some momentum and coverage when they're thinking about making those decisions.
That's really great. Ariel, I'm going to turn to you, because we had a conversation the other day where we were just talking about challenges and potential opposition to some of the work that you have been driving. And you made an interesting remark to me that, contrary to some other things that you have worked on, that the traditional opposition hasn't necessarily been there for this. I'm wondering if you could just talk about what has been most challenging, and what, if any, opposition has existed as you've been prioritizing this work to fund everything?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, it's really hard right now to deny the experience of families who are struggling. And it's hard to argue with a mom who knows that her daughter needs reading support. And so it just makes it a different conversation than it's ever been before. Additionally, a lot of the work that we're doing around funding is specifically focused on extended learning opportunities, so work outside of a traditional school day, which we would argue is actually really helpful to teachers and to professionals inside school, because I think at this point we're well aware that it's going to be really hard to catch kids up in a 7-hour school day. And so having the ability to extend learning so that they're learning beyond just the school day is going to be supportive to teachers, and it's going to be supportive to schools. And so that's the way that we've really been framing it as we're asking for additional dollars to go directly to families, is that families are in need of it. There's no arguing with that. I think, we have families who've shown up at the State Board of Education, talked about the money that they've spent on their students' learning, and how difficult that's been. We have families who've maxed out their credit cards on paying for learning for their students since March, and they're asking for help, and it's really hard to deny that. One of the other challenges that I think is really important to uplift is even those who want to support this work can't right now because we don't have a stimulus that is allowing us a new bucket of money to work with. And so we really hope that in the coming months, we see a stimulus package that again allows the autonomy of states to provide the programming that they need for their students, but importantly provides an extra batch of funding to help us mitigate learning loss long term.
Thanks very much. I'm going to shift away from tactics, and I want to talk about what's next, because it's clear that we all hope in the next few months we are going to be on the road to recovery and adapting from an emergency mindset to a recovery mindset. Victor, starting with you here, when you look at the landscape in Tennessee, a hypothetical future landscape where a vaccine is available, where it's distributed, what do you think is going to be most important to prioritize during this recovery period?
Yeah, thank you, Ned. So I think it's important to look at this in the short term and look at it in the long term. So I think in the short term, to kind of piggyback off what Ariel just said, using those federal dollars to get money directly into the hands of families. I'm still one of Stephen's phrases here. Our kids can't wait, so we need to get those dollars from the federal government directly into the hands of families. Like no patching through to different entities, like from the bank to the hands. Right. That's how it has to go in order to really ensure that we're helping these families. And then long term, again, this pandemic has exposed a lot of holes and fallacies in our education system. And so, again, we need to rethink how we're funding education, how we are funding the needs of each child, whether that child is a special needs student or that child is an ELL student or whatever other qualifier there is, that you're ensuring that the needs of all the subgroups of kids and learners are being met. We actually, TennesseeCAN actually did a survey. We do an annual survey of district leaders and school leaders. And, this year there is an uptick in district leaders, superintendents of school districts who said that of 70% that said the current funding formula in Tennessee is inadequate. Okay, that's a problem, right? That they feel that way. That they feel they don't have flexibility to ensure that the needs of their kids and under their jurisdiction are being met. And then we also did one with school leaders, similar numbers, 65%. And then there's a plurality where 0 school leaders, 0 district leaders felt that the funding formula should remain the same.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's just so critical that as we push forward, that conversations around equity are not lost in this current environment where so many different types of families are suffering. Stephen, what are you hearing from your parents in this in your grassroots group? What are you hearing their top priorities, their top needs over the next 6 months are going to be?
Yeah, I think it's going back to that quote, if our kids can't wait, right? When it comes to school options, I think we have to fund options, and it has to be traditional, public, private, charter, but it also has to include learning pods, and it also has to include micro schools. If we don't do it, we're not necessarily meeting the needs of families right now. No parent is alike. I think of the city of Atlanta as an example. We have one side of the district that wants to go back 5 days a week. And then we have one side of the district that wants to be completely virtual. And so providing those options in that way could be huge to parents. And if you're a lawmaker on this call, I encourage you to lead the charge on it. I think one of the things too we're seeing is that the support for learning loss. And to Ariel's point, having that extra support beyond this normal school day could be massive. Or addressing it. And I applaud some school districts in Georgia already doing this, but we need to have a plan across the state of Georgia to have that access to families and provide them with those needs across the board. And then I think also addressing the needs of students with special needs. That's been a top priority for all of our work here in our state. Understanding that the diversity of our work is super important, but also knowing that their needs are very different than a traditional public school, a traditional student that might be learning.
Thanks, Stephen. I want to pivot back to Ariel and Victor. Ariel, you brought up, actually you both brought up the need for a greater pot of money to work with here to really drive change. This is a magic wand question, right? But assume you have a magic wand, you can wave it, you have the resources that you need to make the change that you want. What do you think that money should then be spent on over the next several months?
I wish I had a magic wand that created money. That would be great. But while we're dreaming, I think that the first thing is really getting money into the hands of families, because I think that they are the ones that know what their kids need right now. I just had a conversation with a mom last night whose daughter has been struggling in reading, and she was like, Ariel, I've just figured out what the problem is. I don't think she can hear. I think that she needs a hearing aid. And it was like this immediate, like, I know what the problem is and now I know how to solve it. And if only I had the resources to then get her the speech therapy that she needs, and, the accommodations and supports that she needs, we'd be able to solve this really quickly for her. But at the same time, that mom is also a mom who we bought diapers for yesterday, because she's struggling in this economy. And so having the ability to give families the resources that they need is huge. I think in addition, giving families the choices that they need in this moment. Every experience is different. We have families who really want to go back to in-person learning and don't have that option right now. We also have families who have been deeply impacted by COVID personally, who understand how dangerous it can be when their family members have gotten it and they've seen their family members be in the ICU for a month. And so they're not willing to put their kids back into full-time school right now because they're scared. We have family members who have family members who are older, multi-generational households, who are not willing to put their students back in school because they have at-risk individuals at home. And so we know that those families need the choices so that their students still have access to a high-quality public education. And so building things like pods, funding programs like homeschooling programs, and giving families the option for high-quality in-person learning is huge right now.
Yes. Yes to all of what Ariel just said. Again, I keep saying this, but it's super important. Like, we get the dollars directly into the hands of families. Every family's situation is different. And again, time to be creative about using these dollars. So micro grants for families for tutoring, right? Micro grants even for teachers, to pay a teacher who does not necessarily want to be in a brick and mortar, but works together with a learning community or a learning pod. You can pay the teacher with that. Or students can attend school virtually in a different state, at a different school, right? Paying for those supplies. And another option for families who do want to go the homeschool route because they're not satisfied with the quality of online or in-person learning with their school, using those resources to help give parents the supports that they need so they can adequately teach their kids. Something else, continuing to assess learning loss. So looking at schools that are continuously measuring and assessing their students, and then schools that are thriving in the midst of the pandemic, who still find a way to get the job done because they're plugging away, right? And then last thing I would say, and this is very important, no money for not doing anything, like no participation trophies here. Like if you're sitting around and you're not, fighting for the kids in your jurisdiction, then you should not get any of these dollars, right? Like can't put kids' lives on pause like it's some Netflix documentary that you've been watching during quarantine. It's not how it works. So got to make sure that you're pushing everyone to do what they can to ensure that the inevitable learning loss does not create an even wider achievement gap for these kids.
That is certainly a call to action if I've ever heard one. Thank you both, Victor, Ariel. We are going to pull out now and shift to questions from the audience here. I'm going to start with a question from our very own Darrell Bradford, who asks, can any of you talk specifically about your plans to cement or grow current policy wins, in particular those that send funds directly to families? I know we talked a little bit about this, and revealing kind of your tactical plans for what you're doing in the future can be a bit like reading the spoilers of a television show before you watch it. But anything that you can share, Ariel, I know you have really thought about using proof points that you brought up earlier as models for potentially future advocacy or future legislation. Why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so we're right in the middle of a special session right now here in Colorado, which has been both a fun addition to the beginning of December and also kind of a stressful one. But we have sort of started to introduce some of these real needs of families as potential legislative concepts moving us into January, which is our traditional legislative session here in Colorado. And I think we're seeing an acknowledgement from lawmakers across the aisle who are saying, you're right, families do need support right now. And we're hearing it loud and clear from our constituents. And so I think that we will likely have a piece of legislation introduced in the actual legislative session that helps us give families access to extended learning opportunity grants. And so that's one of the ways that we're pushing things forward. In terms of pods, which is another thing that I think is a missing component in a lot of our district plans right now across Colorado, we really believe that the person that should be initiating that is our districts, because we've seen districts do it well, again, pointing to Adams 12. And so we're really working with districts to help them diversify their options moving into January. Our governor has set up a task force of key education leaders across the state to examine how we can provide better education for students during this time leading into January. And I think that movement, so first it's an acknowledgement that things aren't working, which I think is really important and something that we were not necessarily hearing from our leaders before. And second, it's a commitment to our kids that we're going to create better options for them moving into January. And so we're seeing some real movement as we enter second semester. But it will be super important to remember that even if we course correct in January, we've lost an entire almost 2 semesters of learning. So there's going to be a need for additional mitigation of learning loss there.
Thank you. Victor, Stephen, anything to add to that? Plans to cement or grow the current policy wins moving forward?
I think we can add something. I think, GeorgiaCAN has really engaged families across the state. And one of the things that we've been really trying to push families to do is do those direct conversations with lawmakers and explain why a micro grant program would be helpful, or an option like an expansion of like an ESA or a private school option in the community. I think that has been one of our top priorities in cementing those kind of next steps. And I think they've been really relatively well welcomed by lawmakers. And those direct conversations have been pivotal in potentially building some success into the next session. I think also looking at expanding on current programs that already exist in our state. I think budgets are always the problem here in our work. And so understanding that maybe there's opportunities to expand to families currently that use maybe a special needs scholarship or other things that exist in the conversation, and how do we improve on those things?
Yeah, I'll hop in here. So I would say, I mean, we've already begun having conversations with lawmakers. We'll have a new General Assembly in the 112th General Assembly in January. So having conversations with those new members and current members, shoring up members who are supportive of student-centered policies right now, super important. And then, kind of going back to the micro grants and the dollars into the hands of families. So some of you may know Tennessee passed an education savings accounts program in 2019. Unfortunately, it's been tied up in the court systems. And so there's not an ESA right now. And because there's not an ESA, this is why we need those dollars directly into the hands of families. We need those micro grants. So that call to action is super important. And then from the parent advocacy side, we'll continue connecting those parents with lawmakers. Again, those voices are super important. And that's what we consider one of our top duties, is to be that bridge builder between those parent voices and those lawmakers.
Thank you. This next question from Cassandra I find really, really interesting, which is, she says that she read 50CAN's Experiments in Advocacy report that gathers up the best practices of advocates, also available at 50can.org. And she asks, how might parent advocacy best practices change going forward? And I guess I'll actually start by asking you all, have your advocacy best practices changed thus far during the COVID-19 pandemic? And if so, how? And then do you anticipate them changing even further from there? So whoever would like to start.
I mean, I think I mentioned this earlier, but I wish that I had discovered Zoom meetings for convening families way before COVID. As a mom myself, I guess I should have recognized this, like getting your kid packed up, packing snacks, getting them in the car, going to a meeting in the evening is just, it's hard. It's like having moving luggage in an airport. And so I wish that I had thought of creating more accessible platforms for families long before this moment. We have a lot more participation in our Zoom parent meetings, and we have one today at 2. And parents are like, and folding laundry, cooking, like doing all the things that they need to get done around the house while still being really active participants. And it's really opened up our ability to connect with families. Another thing that we did as a result of COVID-related shutdowns and our inability to convene families in person is we started a Slack channel for families where families can connect and collaborate with each other. And that has been huge. Families are able to share resources, talk about challenges, share interesting projects that they're doing with their kids. And they've been able to do that without an organizer present, which has made it really awesome because they don't need us to facilitate it, which makes it way more live and active than it could have ever been with us booking meeting space. So I think those are the two things that I would say is we've created online platforms that have actually become way more accessible to families. And I'll also just say, I think that our work around language equity has been easier during this moment in time, providing translation and interpretation on all of our platforms and in our Zoom meetings. Our Zoom meetings are always interpreted into Spanish and in any other language upon request. So far, we've interpreted our meetings into Swahili, Arabic, Amharic, Portuguese, French, and Vietnamese. And so we've been able to do that because of the ability to utilize technology. And so I would say that there's a lot of things we're learning that I don't want to lose at the end of this pandemic.
I would second that, Ariel. I think finding that Zoom was super powerful in this work, and like being able to connect with people, especially when you're in a state like the size of Georgia, right? You're being able to really connect with so many people across the ground and talk to them, whether they're in Dougherty County or they're all the way up in Gwinnett County or in Atlanta. I think one thing that we are looking forward to talking through is like, what does session look like? And how does that impact our engagement when it comes to testimony and training parents on like Zoom testimony and all these other great things that I think necessarily have entered our world in this space. And what does that face-to-face interaction look like? Are there going to be people at the Capitol? We haven't had a clarification that in our state, but I think it's something that it's a big piece of that. We spent some time this year training parents through an advocacy training program called EPIC. And we really have built a strong base of advocates ready to change in our space. And hopefully we'll see the benefits out of that conversation. But I think as your point, like the things I don't want to lose are like Zoom meetings and that level of like engagement. Facebook groups are another big way that we've engaged our families too. And there's a lot of hot takes there for sure.
That's great. Victor, as you have been going through this elite negotiations process, have you stumbled on any best practices on that side that have changed as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, I will say, now that, we're relegated to just, a virtual platform, it have had more engagement from a legislative standpoint with parents talking to lawmakers. So that's been super. That's been great for not only for us but for parents and students even to speak directly with their state representative or their state senator. It will be interesting to see how legislative session unfolds here in Tennessee with access to buildings and just general COVID floating around. But that's been one of the silver linings in this, being able to directly engage legislators, and then legislators themselves. They love talking to constituents, right? They love talking to people from their district. In some cases, they will only speak with people from their district. So that's been one of the good things about that we've been able to pivot and ensure that we're still had a high level of engagement.
Thank you. We've got one last question here. This is from Walter. Hey, Walter, it's good to see you. And I'm going to direct it to Stephen. Walter asks, what is the most effective way to start building a strong parent network? I imagine the answer does involve pizza, but I'll let Stephen speak more.
Walter, I could spend hours on this question. I think it's about building relationships. At the end of the day, it's not about I think there's a difference between organizing and mobilizing, right? You've got to spend time with parents and just get to know them. It takes time. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon. And really having those individual conversations, talking to parents directly, understanding where they're coming from, and really the empathy is the biggest piece of this work. And I will say that is the key piece of building a strong parent network. And you'll see the benefits. It might not be overnight. It may be a couple months to years, or maybe even decades sometimes. But I do think you'll see that they trust you, they support you, and they'll be with you along those processes if you actually take that time to do that individual conversation.
Thanks. Well, that sums up our panel, Fun to Everything. I want to close on one note, which is, there's this old Mr. Rogers quote, which says that in times of crisis or in times of emergency, you should look to the helpers. And it's so clear, Victor, Stephen, Ariel, that when it comes to the education systems in your states, you are very much the helpers and trying to help resolve this situation as fluidly as possible and in a way that sets up students for longer term success and a system that over the long term is going to better meet their needs. So I know personally, I'm just really appreciative for the work that you all are doing. And thank you for being here today. Also, thank you to our audience and EdPalooza for giving us this space to discuss the work at 50CAN. And I just want to remind everyone that both Fund Everything as well as its companion policy brief, Measure Everything, are both available at 50can.org. Thanks. Have a great rest of EdPalooza. We'll see you soon.